What if the road doesn't just take you somewhere? What if the road itself is a destination? A place with its own geography, its own rules, and its own malevolent will. The loneliest roads aren't empty. They're just waiting. They're a kind of purgatory, and if you're not careful, they'll claim you too. Tonight, we're diving into a true horror story that actually happened on Highway 190, a desolate stretch of asphalt that truckers call the Blackout Zone. It's a place where time breaks and sanity is the first thing to go. You think you know what's out there in the dark, but you have no idea what's already behind you. The sun bleeds across the horizon, painting the Arizona desert in bruised purples and burnt orange. At a forgotten truck stop, a lone rig idles, its diesel engine a low, rhythmic heartbeat against the encroaching silence. Inside the small diner, a young man named Marcus, his face still smooth with naive optimism, sips coffee across from a veteran trucker. The old man, whose eyes have seen 1,000 highways, speaks in a low, gravelly voice. He isn't talking about traffic or engine trouble. He's talking about a place. He's talking about Highway 190 and the stretch they call the Blackout Zone. He says it's where all the scary trucker stories, real life began for him and a dozen others he knows. The veteran's voice is as dry as the desert air, thick with the weight of things he's seen but can't explain. He speaks of a road that doesn't just run through the landscape, it runs through time. He warns Marcus about the way the asphalt can feel like it's swallowing the light, how the CB radio picks up whispers from places that shouldn't exist. He's trying to convey a kind of dread that can't be put into words, a specific flavor of fear that sticks to your soul like oil and dust. He watches the younger man, seeing his own past naivety reflected back, a foolish eagerness to conquer the open road. "Kid, this isn't just a tough haul," the old man says, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Out there, the road is a lie. The things you hear on the wind? That's not wind. The silence? That's what you gotta be scared of. It's not the lack of noise. It's the lack of everything. You could drive for days and never know if it's the same day you started." Marcus tries to laugh it off, but the sound dies in his throat. The veteran's gaze is too intense, too sincere. The air in the diner has grown impossibly still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the young man's decision. Marcus claps the old man on the shoulder, a gesture of thanks and confident dismissal. He climbs back into his rig, the warm glow of the dashboard a beacon of familiar reality. The engine roars to life, a comforting sound of power and control. As he pulls out onto the dark highway, the truck stop shrinks in his rearview mirror until it's just a pinprick of light. The CB crackles to life with a familiar static. The old trucker's last words echoed, a promise of dread. The road unwound beneath Marcus's tires, a black ribbon stretching into a void of stars and shadow. The dashboard glowed with its familiar, comforting green light. For a moment, the world felt sane again. The humming of the engine and the smooth roll of the asphalt was all he needed. He settled into the rhythm of the highway when he noticed a pair of headlights in his rearview mirror. They appeared small at first, then grew unnervingly fast. They weren't flashing or weaving. They were just coming silently, with a relentless purpose. Marcus checked his side mirrors, bracing for the blare of a horn and the roar of a passing engine. But there was only silence. The lights were almost on his bumper now, blinding in their intensity, but he couldn't hear a thing. It was like watching a film with the sound muted. The silent approach was the most unnerving part of all the highway horror stories he'd heard. As the vehicle pulled into his left lane, its shape became clear. A rust-pitted, skeletal rig from a bygone era, its ancient grille and high cab a dark silhouette against the moonless sky. A chill crept up his spine, unrelated to the air conditioning. He peered over, squinting to see the driver. The cab's window was a black hole, No driver, no sign of life, just a deep, consuming emptiness. The phantom rig kept pace with him for a few more silent beats. Just as Marcus was about to swerve, the lights of the truck blinked out. Not dimmed, not turned off, but simply gone. The dark shape beside him vanished with them, as if it had never been there at all. Marcus slammed on the brakes, his own truck shuddering to a halt in the middle of the empty highway. The only sound was the screech of his tires on the pavement and the frantic pounding in his own chest. He stared into his rearview mirror, the lights of his rig illuminating a perfectly empty stretch of road behind him. There was nothing, not even a dust cloud. He gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, unable to make sense of what he just saw. A shadow truck appeared in his mirror, but its engine was silent. Marcus drove on. The memory of the phantom struck a cold knot in his stomach. The need for fuel became his anchor, a simple, rational objective to focus on. Up ahead, a small, isolated gas station appeared in the vast emptiness, its old neon sign flickering like a dying firefly. It was a rustic, vintage place, looking like it had been there for 100 years. He pulled off the highway and onto the gravel lot, the comforting crunch beneath his tires, a welcome sound after the silence of the phantom rig. He stepped out of the cab, his boots hitting the hard ground. The night air was surprisingly still and cold, a bone-deep chill that felt unnatural for the desert. There was no attendant, but the gas pump worked. As he filled the tank, he felt a strange prickling on the back of his neck. It was more than just a feeling of being watched. It was the sensation that the very atoms around him were being rearranged. This unsettling feeling was a key element in the asphalt shadows. Real-life trucker horror stories he'd been warned about. A sense of something fundamentally wrong. The pump clicked off, and he hung up the nozzle, the cold from the place clinging to his clothes and skin. He shivered, not from the temperature, but from an inner dread he couldn't name. He got back in the cab and slammed the door, the sound echoing hollowly. He turned the key, and the engine strained before finally rumbling to life. The radio crackled again, but this time he heard a distorted, electronic whisper that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He shifted into drive and sped away, needing to put distance between himself and this place. He drove for a few miles, the road a dark line in his headlights. He glanced at his rearview mirror, wanting to confirm the old gas station was still a tangible landmark behind him. But there was nothing. The road was empty, the flickering neon sign a total absence in the darkness. He felt a wave of nausea. There was no turnoff, no other road it could have been on. It was simply gone. The only thing left of it was the profound and terrible cold that now filled his cab. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw only an empty road. Marcus drove for miles, the phantom cold from the vanished gas station clinging to his cab. The road was a blur, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He needed to stop, to get out of the truck and convince himself that the world was still real. He saw a faded sign for a rest area, a concrete shell long abandoned, its windows like vacant eyes. The cab felt suffocating now, a rolling tomb of his own paranoia. He pulled into the lot, the tires crunching on broken glass and gravel, and got out into the stagnant, heavy air. He walked into the skeletal building, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The interior was a tomb of dust and decay, the air thick with the smell of old concrete and something else, something stale and old. In a corner, half buried in a pile of rubble, he saw a small, leather-bound book. He picked it up. It was a trucker's logbook. It was cold to the touch, not just from the night air, but with an impossible, otherworldly cold. He flipped it open, the pages brittle and yellowed, the handwritten scrawl of a man named Jimmy, a ghostly narrative. As he read, Marcus's blood ran cold. Jimmy's journey mirrored his own. The entries spoke of a silent truck that appeared and disappeared. Then, a gas station that vanished, leaving an unnatural chill behind. The words became more frantic, the sentences shorter and more desperate, describing increasingly terrifying paranormal road encounters. The logbook was not a series of stories. It was a map of his own unfolding nightmare. Each page was a new layer of dread, detailing an escalating loss of sanity, a descent into the heart of the blackout zone. The final pages were a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. Jimmy wrote about the cold that won't leave the cab, the whispers from the asphalt itself, and a growing sense of a malevolent presence watching him. The last entry was a desperate confession, the words smeared with what looked like a thumbprint. It was a final, chilling account of being trapped, of a pursuit that had no end. It wasn't just a record of someone else's terror. It was a prelude to his own. The final entry wasn't a warning. It was a desperate plea. The words from Jimmy's logbook were like a brand on Marcus's mind. The road felt different now, alive and hungry. He drove on, his eyes darting between his mirrors and the desolate highway ahead. That's when the fog rolled in, a thick, greasy wall of white that swallowed his headlights. He had to slow to a crawl, the world outside his truck becoming an indistinct blur. Through the soup of swirling mist, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, a lone woman with long, dark hair, standing still as a scarecrow. Every instinct told him to keep driving. He'd heard 1,000 scary trucker stories, real life and fiction, that started exactly like this. But her sheer, unnatural stillness pulled him over. He unlocked the passenger door. She opened it herself, the latch a squeak in the thick silence. She got in without a word, a rustle of clothing, or a sound of movement. He couldn't see her face in the dim glow of the dashboard. She just sat there, perfectly still, hands clasped in her lap. The temperature in the cab immediately plummeted, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Marcus tried to speak, a nervous stream of "where you headed?" and "it's a nasty night," but his words fell into a void. She didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head. The silence she brought with her was heavy and suffocating, a weight that pressed down on him. The chill radiating from her was so profound it made his breath mist in the air. It felt less like a person and more like an ice sculpture had been placed next to him, a chilling extension of the road's malevolence. He turned his head to look at her again, and for just a second, his eyes were off the road. When he looked back, the passenger seat was empty. She wasn't there. The door hadn't opened. The seatbelt hadn't unlatched. She was just gone, leaving behind only the cold that had come with her. He hit the gas, the diesel engine screaming as he tried to outrun the phantom presence that now shared his cab. The cab's air grew impossibly cold, and she was gone. The cab was now an icebox of dread, the lingering cold from the hitchhiker, a constant physical reminder of his shattered reality. Marcus drove faster, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and terror. He reached for his phone, a desperate need for a connection, for a voice, for anything but the suffocating silence. The screen was a blank void. He looked at his GPS. Its digital map was just a block of static. He was truly alone, disconnected from the world he knew, his only company the phantom chill and the endless road. Just as a primal panic began to set in, he saw it. A sign on the side of the road, old and rusted, but its words were lit with a strange, otherworldly glow. "Welcome to Blackwater, 0.5 miles." A surge of relief, electric and dizzying, shot through him. A town, people, a safe harbor. This was a classic climax in 100 highway horror stories, but his mind clung to the promise of civilization like a drowning man to a life raft. He would take any chance to escape the desolate highway. He pushed the gas pedal to the floor. As he sped closer, the sign seemed to shimmer. The welcome to part flickered and went dark, leaving only Blackwater, 0.5 miles glowing with a malicious intensity. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, as if the sign were actively watching him, guiding him. The road itself felt different, the asphalt humming with a low, sinister energy, almost pulling his rig toward the sign's promise. He was no longer just driving. He was being led into a deeper, darker part of the blackout zone. He looked at his odometer. It read 6 miles, then 7, then 8. He was well past where the town should have been. He looked back at the sign in his rearview mirror, and it still read, with an eerie, unblinking glow, 5 miles. The terrible truth washed over him. The sign wasn't a marker. It was a lie. The road wasn't a path. It was a trap, a loop designed to ensnare him. He was following a phantom, an impossible destination, a world that no longer made sense. He followed the sign, knowing deep down it was a lie. The sign that lead had shattered Marcus's last hold on sanity. He drove on, his hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white, his eyes fixed on the road. Watching for the marker, he now dreaded more than anything. Mile marker 13. The logbook had screamed its name. A place where many had disappeared. A place the old trucker had warned him about. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken malevolence. It was the place where the road seemed to finally claim its prey. Just as his odometer ticked past the 13th mile, the truck's engine sputtered. The headlights flickered and then died, plunging the world outside his cab into a pitch-black void. The dashboard lights winked out, one by one, leaving him in a suffocating darkness. The silence that followed was complete, a sudden, final end to the sounds of his engine and the tires on the asphalt. This was no ordinary mechanical failure. This was the road itself, flexing its power, confirming every chilling account from the asphalt shadows. Real-life trucker horror stories he had once dismissed as folklore. He twisted the key in the ignition again and again, but the engine was utterly dead. He was now a sitting duck in a place he was told to avoid at all costs. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed in on him. Then, a new sound cut through it. The CB radio, which had been dead for hours, hissed to life. It was a distorted, electronic whisper that sounded like nothing he had ever heard before. It wasn't a human voice. It was a groan from the darkness itself. The whispers grew louder, clearer. He strained to make out the words and realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't just whispers. They were voices, a chorus of voices, all calling his name. They were filled with an unspeakable sorrow and a desperate, bone-deep terror. He reached to turn off the radio, but he froze. The sound wasn't coming from the speaker. It was all around him, a chilling symphony of the damned, echoing within the small confines of his cab, a physical presence that pressed in on him from all sides. The voices called to him, not from the radio, but from within. The voices were a symphony of sorrow and terror, echoing inside Marcus's skull from the depths of mile marker 13. He gripped his steering wheel, his mind unraveling with every shriek and sob. His truck was a tomb, sealed off from reality. In a last, desperate bid for sanity, he pulled out his cell phone, which had been dead for hours. To his shock, the screen flickered to life, showing a full signal, an impossible lifeline in the heart of the blackout zone. He didn't question it. He just needed to call someone, anyone. Just as he was about to dial, the phone rang. The screen showed an unknown number. His finger hovered over the screen. Every survival instinct screamed at him to ignore it, but the need for a human voice was too great. He answered. A torrent of static and garbled screams flooded his ear, 1,000 voices crying out at once, begging for help, for escape. The sound was an auditory assault, a horrific continuation of the voices from the air, a chilling new layer to the night's paranormal road encounters. The call ended. Before he could process it, the phone rang again. A different unknown number. He answered. This time, the voice was a distorted plea, but the words were clear. Don't go back. He's waiting for you. The voice sounded like a man, panicked and terrified. It cut off abruptly, leaving Marcus to grapple with the chilling message. Who was waiting for him? Who was this desperate man? The chilling nature of the calls was a cold, hard dose of reality. Then, the phone rang a third time. He answered without thinking. A new voice filled his ear, a whisper that was both familiar and alien. It was his own voice, a distorted, terrified echo of himself screaming about the endless loop, about the cold that wouldn't leave, about the silent truck that was always just behind him. The voice wasn't a stranger. It was a reflection of his own fate, a final, horrifying warning from the version of himself that was already trapped in this timeless nightmare. They weren't calling him. They were calling from his future. The abandoned motel was just another stop on a road that now felt less like a highway and more like a predator's gullet. Marcus was back on the asphalt, but the sensation of 100 empty eyes watching him from the shadows was a physical weight on his shoulders. He knew the road was a trap, a living thing, but it was also the only way forward, a twisted path to a non-existent escape. The cab felt small and fragile, a glass and steel bubble hurtling through an endless, hostile void. He pulled his rig into the overgrown lot, the tires crushing dead weeds. The motel was a skeletal structure under the moonlight, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the darkness. The sign, missing its first two letters, read only O-T-E-L. A profound sense of desolation hung in the air, but beneath it, there was a feeling of anticipation, as if the place had been waiting for him. He got out of the cab, the unnatural cold from the hitchhiker and the gas station still clinging to him. This was the stuff of 1,000 scary trucker stories real life, but he was too desperate to care. He entered the front office, the door swinging open with a rusty groan. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of decay, the furniture shrouded in a thick layer of dust. In the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of movement, a quick, darting shadow that vanished as soon as he turned his head. He tried to rationalize it as a trick of the dim light or his own frayed nerves. He moved deeper into the lobby, his boots kicking up dust, a sudden glint of light from a window on the second floor catching his eye. He found a room with an unlocked door. It was empty, a dust-covered bed, the only piece of furniture left. As he stood there, trying to catch his breath, he looked out the window. A flash of light appeared in the window directly across the small courtyard, followed by another and another. He squinted into the darkness and saw them. Motionless figures, dark shapes behind the grimy glass. They weren't moving, but he could feel their gazes on him, 100 empty eyes watching his every move. He wasn't alone, and they were watching him from every window. The image of the entity's face in his rearview mirror had burned itself into Marcus's mind. He drove, but his hands were trembling, and his mind felt fractured, the line between reality and nightmare erased. The humming of his engine had changed, becoming a low, dissonant drone. He reached for the radio, seeking a distraction, a human voice, anything to break the horrible silence. He glanced at his rearview mirror, a nervous tick he couldn't break. The empty road behind him was a dark, endless expanse. But then, a shape began to coalesce in the glass, a dark, vertical line that seemed to grow out of the asphalt itself. It was a tall, impossibly thin figure. It was miles back, but in the mirror, he could see it with unnerving clarity. This was no ordinary illusion, no trick of the light. This was a direct, chilling new entry to his personal book of highway horror stories. The figure started to move, its long, spindly legs covering ground at a terrifying speed. It wasn't running so much as gliding, a silent, fluid motion that defied the laws of physics. As it got closer, he could make out more detail, a featureless head and two brilliant pinpricks of pure white light where eyes should have been. It was a manifestation of the dread itself, a physical horror born of the road, and it was gaining on him. The headlights of his own truck seemed to dim in its presence. He pressed the gas pedal to the floor, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. But the truck felt sluggish, as if it were sinking into the asphalt. He looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The figure was right behind his cab, its form filling the entire window. But then, with a gut-wrenching lurch of terror, he realized it wasn't just behind him. Its horrifying, eyeless face was superimposed over his own, a perfect, terrifying reflection in the glass, its pinprick eyes staring not at the road, but at him. The entity in the mirror was no longer a reflection of him. The image of the entity's face in his rearview mirror had burned itself into Marcus's mind. He drove, but his hands were trembling, and his mind felt fractured. The line between reality and nightmare erased. The humming of his engine had changed, becoming a low, dissonant drone. He reached for the radio, seeking a distraction, a human voice, anything to break the horrible silence. He turned the dial, and a miracle happened. The radio didn't just hiss with static. It came to life with a clear, perfect broadcast. It was a woman's voice, calm and detached, as if reading from a script. She began to narrate a story. She described a truck, an old model freightliner, its engine struggling, its tires humming. She spoke of the night, the highway, and the growing dread in the driver's heart. She was describing his truck, his drive, his night, with a chilling precision that made his skin crawl. This was a new, horrifying kind of asphalt shadows. Real-life trucker horror stories, a narration of his own demise. He gripped the steering wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice continued, giving specific details about the road ahead, a bend in the highway, a broken guardrail. The woman calmly stated that this was the scene of a fatal accident, detailing how the truck would leave the road and plummet into the ravine below. He knew the spot she was talking about. It was less than a mile ahead. The narration wasn't a past tense account. It was a chilling, present tense description of the future. His future. Marcus slammed on the brakes, but the pedal was dead. The truck's engine continued its strange, low hum, and the wheels kept turning. He tried to swerve off the road, to drive into the desolate desert, but the steering wheel was locked, held by an invisible force. He was trapped, being driven like a ghost to a destination he couldn't escape. The voice on the radio continued its calm narration, each word a chillingly accurate description of the last moments of his life, pulling him closer to the fatal turn. The voice wasn't a warning. It was a promise of what was to come. The truck's autonomous drive ended with a sharp, hydraulic hiss. Marcus was alive, against all odds, having passed the fatal turn from the radio's narration without crashing. The truck had come to a halt in the brightly lit lot of a gas station that looked ripped from a 1950s photograph. It was a beacon of impossible normalcy, filled with old cars and silent figures pumping gas, a stark contrast to the desolate nightmare of the road. Dazed and disoriented, Marcus stumbled from the cab, desperate for the sight of another human face. But as he looked around, a new terror replaced the old one. The people were still. A woman holding a gas nozzle was frozen mid-action. A man talking on a payphone was petrified, his mouth half open. The second hand on the large clock above the gas station entrance was unmoving, a frozen needle at a precise angle. This place wasn't just a rest stop. It was a temporal anomaly, a chilling new form of paranormal road encounters. Time itself had come to a grinding halt here, and he was the only thing moving within it. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the shoulder of a man frozen at a gas pump. The skin was unnaturally cold, like smooth marble, but it wasn't lifeless. He could feel a faint, impossibly slow pulse, a thrum that took minutes to complete a single beat. These people weren't dead. They were trapped. Their moment of rest had been stretched into an eternal, living hell. He felt the cold of the hitchhiker and the gas station return, the very air around him stagnant with frozen despair. He heard a faint, rattling moan, a sound that seemed to travel through the timeless air itself. He looked toward a car parked near the building and saw a face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with a silent scream. He looked at the other cars and saw more faces, all trapped in moments of terror, their mouths open in silent, soundless cries. He was surrounded by the souls the road had claimed. They weren't specters. They were people still alive, still aware, and locked in a living tableau of silent, unending torment. The other drivers were not customers. They were prisoners of the road. Marcus drove away from the timeless gas station. The phantom images of the frozen drivers burned into his mind. He was back on the open road, but it felt less like a highway and more like a predator's gullet, every mile a step deeper into the nightmare. He glanced down at his dashboard, and a fresh wave of panic hit him. The fuel gauge, which had been full when he left the station, was now dropping with impossible speed. The needle was a blur, plunging toward empty. He couldn't believe it. He'd just filled his tank. It was a physical impossibility, a violation of a fundamental law of the universe. He pulled the rig to the side of the road, his heart a frantic drum. He got out and walked to the fuel tank, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The cap was secure, the tank intact, but when he leaned in and listened, there was only a hollow sound. The fuel was gone, a phantom theft. This was a new, cruel rule of the road, another addition to the scary trucker stories real life had to offer, a perfect trap. He jumped back into the cab, a cold terror gripping him. He turned the key, but the engine sputtered once, groaned, and then fell silent. Its final sound, a hollow wheeze. The dashboard lights died, plunging him into absolute blackness. The cab felt small and fragile, a glass and steel coffin in a world that had become hostile. He was no longer in the desolate desert, but surrounded by a dense, suffocating forest that had appeared out of nowhere, its trees like 100 skeletal arms reaching for him. He was a sitting duck, a victim of a perfect crime. He tried to open the door, but it was locked, held in place by an unseen force. He was trapped inside the dead rig, a prisoner of the blackout zone. He stared out into the darkness of the forest, and though he could see nothing, he could feel them. 100 pairs of eyes, watching from the trees. A cold, hungry stillness had fallen over the world, a silence that promised no mercy. The truck was dead, and he was alone with the silent forest. Marcus was a prisoner inside his dead rig, the cab a metal tomb sealed against the silent forest. The trees pressed in on him, a dark, suffocating wall that felt alive and watchful. He was a perfect prey, helpless and alone. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket of dread that promised no escape. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, knowing he couldn't stay, but too terrified to move. He was at a standstill, caught between the suffocating safety of the cab and the unknown horrors waiting in the dark. Then a new sound began. It was a low, resonant hum, a single note that seemed to come from the very ground itself. Slowly, other voices joined in, creating a chorus of low, guttural singing. It was a dissonant, haunting melody, like an ancient Gregorian chant twisted by madness. The sound seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, a sinister, unholy hymn. This was a new, chilling layer of his personal highway horror stories, a sound that should not exist in the natural world. The singing grew louder, the harmony more complex. He could make out individual voices, deep baritones, high-pitched whispers, a child's sweet, chilling hum, all weaving a tapestry of sound that was both beautiful and utterly wrong. He strained to hear the words, but they were gibberish, a language that scraped at the edges of his sanity. The sound wasn't coming from a specific direction. It was everywhere, a living presence in the forest, a perfect auditory trap. Marcus pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but the sound was already inside him. It wasn't just in his ears. It was in his skull, in his bones, rattling him from the inside out. The horrible harmony began to unravel. the beautiful, low notes turning into a rising cacophony of shrieks and sobs. The singing was replaced by a symphony of despair, the chorus of 1,000 lost souls crying out in a shared moment of agony. The sound was no longer a song. He realized the voices weren't singing, they were wailing. The wailing of the lost choir was a fading echo in Marcus's mind, replaced by a new, more profound terror. The truck's engine had roared back to life on its own, and the rig had lurched forward, its headlights cutting a path through the trees. He was no longer in control. He was being piloted, a puppet on a string, a hostage in his own vehicle. He held on to the wheel, his last connection to a physical world that was quickly dissolving into a swirling chaos of sensory assaults. The truck burst from the trees and onto the open highway. For a brief second, he felt a surge of relief, but it evaporated instantly. In the middle of the road, bathed in the blinding light of his own headlights, stood a figure. It was a man, tall and gaunt, but his face was a sickening void. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, bone-white surface. This was a physical manifestation of the unexplainable, a grotesque new entry into his book of asphalt shadows, real-life trucker horror stories. Marcus slammed on the brakes, but the pedal was dead. The truck was a runaway train, pulling him directly toward the faceless figure. The man didn't move. He just stood there, a perfectly still statue of terror. Marcus wrenched the steering wheel to the right, a desperate, gut-instinctive move. The rig swerved violently, his tires screaming on the asphalt, the side mirror grazing the figure's shoulder by an impossible fraction of an inch. He caught a glimpse of the man in his side mirror as he sped past. The figure's arm was raised, its long, bony fingers outstretched. It wasn't reaching for him, but for a churning, dark shadow that was following just behind his truck, a silent, formless presence. The faceless man wasn't a roadblock. He was a gatekeeper, a warning, a physical representation of the road's will. The truck had swerved to avoid the man, but he was forced to drive directly into the path of something far worse. He didn't just swerve to miss him, he swerved to escape something else. The loop had claimed Marcus's sanity, the same twisted trees, the same cracked asphalt, the same dead horizon. He no longer tried to escape. He simply drove, a passenger in his own truck. The road had won. He was a piece of its eternal scenery, a ghost in a machine. He was beyond fear now, just an empty shell of a man driving toward an impossible destination. The road was a living creature, and he was caught in its stomach. In his rearview mirror, a new shape appeared. An old black and white police cruiser, a relic from a bygone era. It was driving without its lights on, a silent, unblinking sentinel in the darkness. It was a new player in his personal collection of scary trucker stories real life had to offer. It wasn't a patrol car. It was a specter, a part of the road's malevolent law. He felt no immediate fear, just a numb sense of resignation, a tired acceptance of the next horror. The cruiser followed him for what felt like hours, perfectly matching his speed. He accelerated, and it sped up. He slammed on the brakes, and it came to a perfect, silent stop with him. He was a prisoner of its will, an object being escorted. He felt a chilling sense of purpose from the car. It wasn't there to chase him. It was there to guide him, to deliver him to a destination he had no desire to reach. It was the road's enforcer, its final authority. He slammed on the brakes one last time, the truck's tires screaming on the asphalt, his mind a void of defiance. He looked in his rearview mirror, but the cruiser was gone. It had simply vanished. There was no turnoff, no flash of light, just a void where it had been a second ago. He was alone again. But then he heard it, a low, rhythmic hum, so close it vibrated through his cab. The sound of a car idling, a low thrum of power. The car was gone, but its sound remained, a final, horrifying promise. The car was gone, but the sound of its idling engine remained. The phantom sound of the idling car had finally broken Marcus. He couldn't stay in the truck anymore. He had to move, to put distance between himself and the impossible noise. He was walking now, a ghost on a road made for machines, his mind devoid of profound, resigned terror. He came upon the skeletal remains of an old gas station, a monument to a time when things made sense. He saw a restroom, the door still on its hinges, and went inside. A desperate need for a moment of quiet, a moment to just exist. He fumbled with the rusted faucet, and a trickle of grimy water sputtered out. He splashed it on his face, the cold liquid a shock that felt almost real. He looked up, his eyes a frantic, empty stare at the mirror above the sink. The glass was cracked, covered in a century of grime, but his reflection was startlingly clear. It was him, a man with hollow eyes and gaunt cheeks, a silent scream of profound, endless terror etched on his face. This was a new, brutal entry into his personal highway horror stories. But it wasn't him. Not completely. The face in the mirror was withered and gray, like a corpse, the skin so transparent he could see the bones beneath it. His eyes were dead, and his lips were pulled back in a silent snarl of fear. He looked down at his own hands, and they were still flesh and blood. But in the mirror, they were skeletal, the fingers long and bony, the fingernails yellowed and cracked. The man in the mirror was what he was becoming, a ghost already, trapped in a living body. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. The dead man in the mirror raised a skeletal hand and pointed a long, bony finger, not at him, but at something behind him, a dark, churning shadow just beyond his line of sight. Marcus spun around, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the dead man's mouth was open in a silent scream, its eyes filled with a new, fresh terror, a warning of what was coming for him. The reflection was no longer a ghost. It was a signpost to his fate. He was looking at his future, and it was already too late. Marcus stumbled from the restroom. The image of his dead reflection burned into his mind. He walked, a lost ghost in the desert, his mind devoid of profound terror. He was no longer trying to escape. He was simply moving forward, a puppet on a string. He found himself at the abandoned rest area again, the same concrete shell he had visited before. It was a terrible, fated return, a final, inescapable point on the road's dark map. He was drawn to the same pile of rubble. The logbook was still there, lying open on the ground, its pages now gray and rusted, as if they had been exposed to the elements for decades. The pages were impossibly cold to the touch. He picked it up, a new kind of dread settling in his stomach. He had to know the end. He had to know what happened to Jimmy. He had to understand the truth behind the asphalt shadows. Real-life trucker horror stories. He flipped to the last page, the one he had looked away from before. The words were a frantic scrawl, a desperate testament to a man's final moments. Jimmy wrote about the entity, not as a ghost or a voice, but as a timekeeper, a being that didn't haunt the road, but was the road itself. He wrote about its power to warp reality, to feed on the fear of its victims, to trap them in an eternal, living hell. The logbook wasn't a history. It was a horrifying roadmap of the road's true malevolent nature. The final entry wasn't a conclusion. It was a final, desperate message to anyone who might find it, scrawled with a bloodied thumbprint. It was a warning about the timekeeper, about the final confrontation. The words spoke of a terrible choice, a final battle for his soul, a desperate plea for escape. The book was a final message from a man who was already gone, a last, horrifying testament from one prisoner to another. The final warning was scrawled on the page, meant for him alone. The chilling truth from the logbook had set Marcus free. He no longer ran. He stood in the middle of the empty highway, a lone figure facing an inevitable end, but with a new, final clarity. The air crackled with a cold energy, and the road itself seemed to hum with a low, malevolent power. The timekeeper, the entity of the road, was here. It was no longer a shadow or a phantom. It was manifesting, taking on a physical form, a swirling vortex of shadows and light, a living, breathing paradox. The creature unfolded, its limbs long and impossibly thin, a grotesque echo of the faceless man. Its eyes were two pinpricks of pure, brilliant light, the same eyes he had seen in his rearview mirror. The cold from the hitchhiker radiated from its very being, and the silent wailing of the lost choir emanated from its form, a constant, low drone of suffering. This was the culmination of every terror, the source of all the paranormal road encounters he had endured. It was a physical manifestation of the road's will, a creature built from fear and time itself. The creature spoke, its voice a horrific chorus of 1,000 distorted voices, a chilling echo of his own voice from the phone call. It told him he was its now, a part of its eternal collection of lost souls, a prisoner just like the others. It offered him an endless cycle of torment, an eternity of reliving his most terrifying moments, a living death from which there was no escape. This wasn't a monster in the classic sense. It was a force of nature, a living prison, a conscious and malevolent ecosystem. Marcus, filled with a final desperate burst of defiance, refused to yield. He wasn't going to be a part of its collection. He grabbed a rusted piece of metal from the ground, a twisted shard of his own rig, and charged at the timekeeper. It wasn't a fight he could win, but it was a fight for his soul, a final act of rebellion against the road that had consumed everything he was. The creature just watched him, its faceless head tilted in a mockery of interest, a slow, knowing grin forming. The blackout zone wasn't a place. It was a creature that consumed. The chilling truth from the logbook had set Marcus free. He no longer ran. He stood in the middle of the empty highway, a lone figure facing an inevitable end, but with a new, final clarity. The air crackled with a cold energy, and the road itself seemed to hum with a low, malevolent power. The timekeeper, the entity of the road, was here. It was no longer a shadow or a phantom. It was manifesting, taking on a physical form, a swirling vortex of shadows and light, a living, breathing paradox. The creature unfolded, its limbs long and impossibly thin, a grotesque echo of the faceless man. Its eyes were two pinpricks of pure, brilliant light, the same eyes he had seen in his rearview mirror. The cold from the hitchhiker radiated from its very being, and the silent wailing of the lost choir emanated from its form, a constant, low drone of suffering. This was the culmination of every terror, the source of all the paranormal road encounters he had endured. It was a physical manifestation of the road's will, a creature built from fear and time itself. The creature spoke, its voice a horrific chorus of 1,000 distorted voices, a chilling echo of his own voice from the phone call. It told him he was its now, a part of its eternal collection of lost souls, a prisoner just like the others. It offered him an endless cycle of torment, an eternity of reliving his most terrifying moments, a living death for which there was no escape. This wasn't a monster in the classic sense. It was a force of nature, a living prison, a conscious and malevolent ecosystem. Marcus, filled with a final desperate burst of defiance, refused to yield. He wasn't going to be a part of its collection. He grabbed a rusted piece of metal from the ground, a twisted shard of his own rig, and charged at the timekeeper. It wasn't a fight he could win, but it was a fight for his soul, a final act of rebellion against the road that had consumed everything he was. The creature just watched him, its faceless head tilted in a mockery of interest, a slow, knowing grin forming. The blackout zone wasn't a place. It was a creature that consumed. The camera cuts to a modern bay scene, a bright, unforgiving sun beating down on a group of young hikers. They are looking at an old, rusted big rig, a ghost from a different era. sitting abandoned in the middle of a desolate stretch of Highway 190. The truck is a monument to time. Its metal oxidized, its tires flat and rotted. It's the same rig Marcus was driving. It's a chilling piece of history, an iconic setting for what would become one of the most chilling, scary trucker stories real life has ever produced. A legend passed down in whispers. One of the hikers, an aspiring historian, points to a small, leather-bound book half buried in the dirt beside the truck. It's Marcus's logbook, weathered and ancient, with the final entry from the previous chapter. They read the entries, their voices hushed, about the silent truck, the vanishing gas station, the faceless man, and the timekeeper. The story seems like pure fiction, a fantastical tale, a perfect scary trucker story's real-life legend. The hikers try to open the truck's door. It groans but holds fast. Just for a laugh, they try to turn the key. To their shock, the key turns, and the engine sputters to a ghostly cough. A sound that should be impossible. A cold, unnatural air rushes from the cab, a chill that has nothing to do with the desert heat. One of the hikers puts his hand on the metal of the engine and recoils in shock. It's impossibly cold, as if it has been sitting there for 100 years in a deep, bone-freezing night. They shine a flashlight into the cab. There is a half-empty coffee mug in the cup holder, a pack of cigarettes, and on the dashboard, a single frozen wristwatch on the dashboard. The hands are frozen at 3:15, the time Marcus's watch stopped in the logbook. The cab is impossibly cold, the same cold that clung to Marcus, a final piece of the timekeeper's torment. The truck is a living tomb, a monument to the road's final victory, its soul now a part of the permanent landscape of the Blackout Zone. The legend of Highway 190 just gained another lost soul. Marcus didn't escape. He didn't die in a car crash or at the hands of a ghost. The Blackout Zone didn't just kill him. It consumed him. It froze him in a perfect, timeless moment, turning his truck into a living monument to his suffering. He isn't gone. He's a part of the road now, a ghost that's still alive, still aware, and still trapped in an endless, waking nightmare. The road didn't just take his life. It stole his future and his past and condemned him to an eternal loop of torment. The timekeeper is not a monster. It is the road itself, a sentient, malevolent force that feeds on fear and time. It waits. It's always waiting. The next time you're on a lonely road and the silence gets too loud, ask yourself, are you driving on the road? Or are you becoming a part of it? For more true horror stories that actually happened, be sure to hit that subscribe button. You never know when the road might come calling.